Very good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it is, wherever you are. Welcome to Hereticals History. This is the second part of our deep dive into the Bronze Age collapse. Today, we are going to be taking a look at not so much the collapse itself, but the civilizations that were around in the Mediterranean region or thereabouts at this time. As always, I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Dan. Dan, it's great to see you out, mate. What's going on?
Good evening, Chris. And I saw that subtle dig there. That was good. It's an
The little in joke for those. We'll explain it in a members only Q&A one day, I'm sure. But Dan,
yes, good to be here.
I don't know about you, mate, but this is one I've been looking forward to. Now, I will say it's one that we originally planned to do a few weeks ago. We haven't done it. Completely my fault. I've actually been unwell. But the good news is I am somewhat back on my feet now. I've got my voice back, which is really important. Pretty hard to stream without a voice. So why don't
you weren't wiped out by the sea people, so that was even better.
Maybe I was. Maybe I fought them off like the brave Egyptians of times past. But so as I mentioned, today we're going to be looking at a few of the different civilizations that were, I guess, the major and a few of the minor civilizations, or I guess not so much minor, but adjacent civilizations that were sort of either directly in the region and affected by the Bronze Age collapse, or those that were sort of the neighboring surrounding areas. So we're going to go through them one by one. I know that this is something I've thoroughly enjoyed researching. I enjoy researching everything pretty much, but this one in particular I've had a lot of fun with. So I'm gonna put you on the spot here a bit, Dan. Out of the civilizations we're looking at today, is there one that really stands out to you, or is there one that has surprised you?
Ooh, so I guess going into this, I've always loved ancient Babylon, but they're a lot more on the periphery than they're still there, and they're still a big hitter. But you've got other interesting nations like the Mycenaeans, who were pre-Greeks, and the Hittites. So the Hittites is an interesting one, especially with the old Hittites and the new Hittites and the differences between the two. And yeah, there's a lot to and of course the Egyptians. The Egyptians are always the superstar.
They're always there. They're always there. And I think that's one thing that's really important to sort of mention. So there are going to be some civilizations that we do talk about, and with some of those civilizations, you'll hear, the Hittites, for example, or the Egyptians. Now, those civilizations, we're going to be talking about the incarnation of them at that time period. So say Egypt, for instance, Egypt still exists now, but Egypt now is very different to, say, Egypt 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago.
Locations.
It hasn't. No, it hasn't. But some civilizations do. Some civilizations will take on the name of different groups of people that they aren't necessarily associated with. I guess a really good modern day example of that is Palestine or Palestinians, which is actually a play on the Greek the Romanized version of the Philistines, who are the ancient biblical enemies of the Jews, and most likely came from the Greek islands.
Yeah.
So most likely, but we're not going to get too much into that today. But that's just to give an example. So I guess we'll kick it off. Let's start with, and of course, if you haven't already, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that. Is that all the stuff I meant to say for YouTube? Is that like the proper streamer stuff?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like and subscribe. Keep liking and subscribing.
Yeah, as at the moment. So this is, we're going out live on the Hereticals History channel. So this is the first time we're going solo on Hereticals History. So we're not going on the main Hereticals channel. Just for anyone wondering, the main Hereticals channel isn't a history channel. That's sort of more a politics, pop culture, current events sort of channel, which really isn't history. And this is something that we want to grow. So as of the time of recording, we've got a grand total of 11 subscribers. Probably really 9 because, I'm one and you're one. So that's okay. It's hopefully this is something we look back at one day and say, "Wow, remember when we had 11 subscribers, and look where we are
if
now."
not, we are just
Now,
having fun anyway.
you know what? Look, the reality is, myself and Dan, we would be sitting here having these conversations anyway. You're just getting the recorded version of us having these conversations. So
Exactly.
enjoy or don't enjoy. It's okay. We're going to talk anyway. So let's kick it off. So the Mycenaean Greeks. So the Mycenaean civilization existed from roughly around about 1600, pretty much up until the Bronze Age collapse occurs. And it's one of the more famous civilizations, but probably not famous, or a lot of people probably don't know it as the Mycenaeans. So when people think of Mycenaean heroes, like say, or legends like say Agamemnon, the great king who conquered, the king of kings who conquered Troy, they're probably just thinking of him as Greek. But the Mycenaean civilization is distinct from the later Greek civilization that occurred, that does show up later. So similar to Greece, or I guess the more modern version of Greece, or the preceding Greek culture, it did have a lot of city-states. So places like Mycenae, obviously, Tiryns, Pylos are some of the well-known ones. And it's a civilization that mainly sort of rose out of the ashes of the old Minoan civilization, although the Minoan civilization still does exist in Crete at this time, but not to the extent that it had previously. So the Mycenaean city-states were ruled by groups of kings with one main king. So you might sort of look at it in a modern context of it was very much a feudalized system where you had the city-states that would have their own ruler, but they all gave tribute to the main king. Agamemnon, for example, would have been one of those main kings.
Kind of like the Roman Empire, where you have all the praetors that are in charge of little regions, and they all report to Caesar, and Caesar's rule is
exactly
is gospel.
That's a pretty good one. That's a good comparison, actually. So I guess if we look at, I guess, economy, trade is something that I'm going to talk about in all the civilizations we're covering today, because that really is what links and combines all of these different nations. So the Mycenaean economy, it's a fairly complex, well-organized economy, very agricultural. Pottery, I think we've all seen Greek pottery. It's very, very famous. You can't miss it. Metalworking, of course. So bronze was one of the main things that they created. They would have been importing a lot of the tin, but I do believe they had copper mines. So and obviously they had the technology to smelt it. And because of their location, they were big traders. So they would trade. They had extensive networks that stretched across the Mediterranean, that exchanged things like olive oil, wine, and pottery for precious metals such as tin. Ivory was a big one that they would have gotten out of Egypt as well, and various other sorts of luxury goods.
And so, sorry, Chris, just an interesting fact from that Eric Klein book that we've been reading as well, 1177. It's in one section of it, it's talking about when the Mycenaeans got big enough and took over Crete, which is the Minoans, or the rest of that civilization, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was when they were established around the 1450 BC mark. They actually took over the international trade routes to Egypt. So as soon as they got that Egyptian trade route, they were a big player in the game then. And obviously once you've got trade route with Egypt in that time, you are top of the civilization chain.
Exactly. It was they were very much the central powers of the time. Now look, they were a militaristic civilization, and look, you can hear about, and you can see that in some of the legends that are spoken about them. So Troy is the obvious one. So for a long time, it was thought that Troy was just a thing of myth and legend. It wasn't actually a real wasn't a real place. It was that's how it was looked at until the archaeologist Schliemann, German archaeologist, he was obsessed with it. Now I call him an archaeologist. He was more of a layman.
He nearly wrecked the site.
Look, he did. He was a bit notorious for it, but I mean, we've got to give credit where it's due.
Yep.
He did a lot for. He found it. They all said he was crazy, but you know what? He showed
and
them.
I think he had to borrow money, and it was his last attempt at being like, right, I'll try and find it, and that's when he found it.
Yeah,
but
you know what? Credit to him. It's a great story about persistence. You know what? He found it. So I guess, look, a lot of archaeological evidence. I guess at sites like Troy, but also when they're going through a lot of sites within the region, it does show that they were certainly warfare was a big part of their culture. It was a warrior culture that continued.
And if you get a chance to read Odyssey or the Iliad, they are brilliant pieces of poetry too. They're long.
They're wonderful.
Yeah, but they're well worth reading.
It's something I think everyone should read. I'm trying to convince my kids at the moment to read it. Slowly but surely, we're getting there. Now, the Mycenaeans, they had one of the earliest forms of writing that we've discovered as well, what's called Linear B script. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to see if I can share, because I actually do have an example of Linear B script. Bear with me. I'm just going to try and make the technology work here. So this is an example of Linear B script. So it's very different to the Greek script that the Greek style of writing that we know and love, and that has kind of been a part of the formation of the Romanized writing that we use now. So as you can see, it's very different. It's not quite, it's not Egyptian.
It kind of looks like a mix. It looks like a mix between hieroglyphics and cuneiform, which is the Babylonian writing, and Akkadian as well. It looks like a mix of the two.
Well, there would have been similarities, and just naturally because of the trade in the region at the time. I think Egyptian hieroglyphics are fairly unique. Within that region, there was something that really sort of stood out as opposed to a lot of the other writing styles.
Yeah.
Although when you look at, say, and we could do a whole multiple episodes on how language and writing developed over time, you can look at, like, say, the letter A, for instance. A was originally upside down and was a pictographical image that then got turned on its side, then got turned the way we know now, and then eventually got Romanized into what we see today. So that's it. But it's an interesting, and I believe it was in the 1950s that it was deciphered. Yeah. So, and that was done by a fellow called Michael Ventris. And from that, we were actually able to get a lot of insights into society and life within that region at the time. So, where the Mycenaeans collapse is at the same time, essentially, as the Bronze Age collapse. They're one of the civilizations that we do see sort of disappear within a generation or so. Obviously, because of the collapse, it's hard to really sort of pinpoint when the society and the civilization collapses, but it goes into essentially what's called the Greek Dark Ages, which last from about the time of the collapse through to about 800 BC, which is when we start to see, I guess, Homer and I guess the more classical Greek society that we know, sort of based out of Athens, Sparta. We hear about in the Iliad, the Odyssey, that Herodotus writes about. Now, although we've got that dark age, and certainly, we see a new culture emerge, and we see a different style of writing emerge, the fact that Homer is able to write about these things hundreds of years later shows that, I think, to an extent, there is either a continuation of culture or certainly a continuation of an oral tradition. Not everything is lost to time, which
and
I think,
sorry, in
wonderful.
that ancient era, oral history was history back then, because
Absolutely.
people had it's hard to imagine now because our memories are all based on computer and we can just save things anywhere. But back then, like, someone would learn Homer's Iliad off by heart and know it off by heart, and then pass that down to the next person and the next person, and people just had this incredible memory to know things and recall things.
And we still see that in modern society, in civilizations where reading and writing isn't as prevalent. So particularly in parts of the Middle East, say, Afghanistan, or parts of Pakistan, where they can't read and write, or a lot of people can't read and write, but what they'll do is they'll memorize the Quran. So they'll be able to recite it, in its entirety. And that's just because of the way that, I guess, their brains are working. They're not sort of, it's like, I guess, with a blind person's got really good hearing, or a deaf person has great eyesight. It's a similar sort of thing. Someone who can't read and write has to memorize these things in a certain way. So look, I think it's quite interesting the way that works. But they were fairly involved with the rest of society, obviously, because of the trade. There's a lot of evidence, and we can see where they've interacted with the Minoans in particular. And in fact, when they essentially took over Minoan society, they absorbed a lot of the culture and religious practices of the Minoans. We've got diplomatic or diplomatic writing and tablets between them and Egypt, the Hittites. So they were certainly powerful trade partners and rivals to a lot of those other nations and powers of the time. So I guess that's the Mycenaeans. Any extra thoughts you've got on the Mycenaeans, or are you ready to move on to the Hittites?
No, let's go to the Hittites.
The Hittites. I know this is one of your favourites, Dan.
Yes.
Did you want to start off on the Hittites? You've got the notes there. I'll let you take that one away.
All right, and feel free to add any comments as well, Chris. But
you know me, I love the sound of my own voice. I can guarantee that I will.
Excellent. Well, the Hittite
He's laughing. It's funny because it's true.
So they were around roughly 1600 to 1180, which is again the similar time to the Bronze Age collapse. So what I was reading this week actually was there is two Hittite empires. There's the old Hittite Empire and there is the new Hittite Empire. So the old Hittite Empire was centered in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they were a dominant political and military power, and they had advanced use of iron and formidable armies. And then,
and I think it's important to note too, I mean, we're talking about the Bronze Age period. They've started developing iron.
Yes.
Now, they're developing iron well before the Iron Age and well before iron becomes such a, I guess, an integral part. Iron is what expanded Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're talking almost 1,000 years, or not quite 1,000, but close to
it,
prior to. And to put that in perspective, that's like someone in the Middle Ages having a computer.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a machine gun.
Or it's Chris got me onto a book recently called The Island in the Sea of Time. It's a time travel book.
Time travel in history.
They go back to the Bronze Age. So, but anyway, that's a story for another day. But what I was reading this week was, I think it was Eric Klein's book actually, that the new Hittite Empire is actually in the Palestine, Israel, Jordan area. And so for a long time, they couldn't figure out what the Hittites were talking about, and there was confusion because they were looking at the biblical entries and it wasn't matching some of the Hittite stuff. And then they finally figured out that the old Hittite Empire was in Turkey, and then the new empire moved more to that that Israel, Lebanon, Palestine area.
And I think to put it in the modern context again, that would be like, say, archaeologists in 2,000 years from now looking at the Philistines of old and the Palestinians of today and trying to work out, well, hang on, did they come from the Greek islands or were they Arabs? So a lot of the time, people will they'll take on the identity or sometimes the name of different groups.
Yes, they will. Yep. So politically, they were similar. They had a monarchy, and it was centralized technically. So Hittite kings, the capital was a place called Hattusa, and
what a great name that is, by the way, Hattusa.
Hattusa sounds very strong.
Hattusa. I'd like to visit Hattusa.
You probably need a archaeology degree. Probably.
I don't have the archaeology degree. I've got the history degree.
Well, yeah, that counts as well. Yeah. But the Hittites, interestingly, despite the fact that they had a centralized monarchy, they had so many internal civil wars. There was lots of jealousy and other issues. There was an occasion where a boat full of goods was supposed to arrive and it didn't, and then there was blame going everywhere, and there was backstabbing, as a lot happened in the ancient world as well. Now, some of the famous kings, I am going to butcher this pronunciation, but here we go. Supilumia I was the one who really expanded the Hittite Empire inside Anatolia. Muwatalli II, who that was a huge fight he had with Ramses II of Egypt. So
that was the Battle of Kadesh.
Yes, do you want to talk about that, Chris? The Battle of Kadesh.
That could be an episode of its own, but it's one that has been written about.
Yes,
and we get information from the Egyptian side, so maybe a little bit of bias there. But look, I guess if you consider the location. And I'm getting back to trade again because I can't emphasize the importance of trade in history and particularly in this region. So you've got Anatolia, Turkey, just to make it easy, modern day Turkey.
Yep.
So a lot of the land route goes through there. Now, in particular, where you've got a lot of the tin coming from Afghanistan, it's coming straight through that region. So every region trade goes through, there's a bit that's taken off, taxed, and then on sold.
Yep.
So it was certainly a very profitable and popular region. And also being land-based, you do see a lot more land battles. The Anatolian region in particular, I mean, we're talking the cradle of civilization. You see sites such as Göbekli Tepe, just to name a few, Troy.
Yeah.
So we're talking, a very ancient and historical region that had a very, very different demographic to its modern one. The modern Turks are more from sort of like Turkmenistan, Central Asia, and it was very much a Greek Mediterranean. So sort of think your Greeks, your Arabs, your Jews, that sort of demographic. What was the prevalent demographic of the time. And look, because of their location, they had a really strong and robust economy. Agriculture, because of, once again, you've got the lands, you're not too far from the plains there as well, was big. Mining and metalworking was huge, particularly with iron. Now, even though it's the Bronze Age, once again, we're going back to iron. And I often wonder, had the Bronze Age collapse not occurred, would we have seen an Iron Age occur earlier? Would that have pushed humanity forward, would we be talking about, the industrial revolution of the 1300s and, the computer revolution of the 1500s?
And the
It's
Hittites,
interesting to think about.
the Hittites would have probably stayed as an empire potentially. We don't know, and we'll never know the answer to these questions. But
look, history, there's a lot of what ifs.
Yes.
And look, they're big trade, obviously, like most metals. They brought in a lot of potteries and textiles, and mainly they were trading with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mycenaeans. And
they were the big ones too. And I know if you look at a lot of manifests and even the I think it's somewhere in Egypt where they've got the stone feet with the lists, and originally they thought that the lists were names of people or countries, but it was actually manifest lists and trade route lists. So it actually listed each town that they went to. So they most of those trade routes were kind of clockwise around the Mediterranean, depending on the winds and all those things. But it was a really advanced network. And even the Egyptians, with their recording of it, they recorded those trade routes, and some of those nations that they mentioned in those lists. We'll get to Egypt soon, but they don't even exist, and historians struggle to find where some of those nations existed actually. So, but anyway, but that's just part of the trade route of the area. So they were trading.
And I guess one thing I do want to mention, and it's something in general. I think we've got this modern perception that people from 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, from this time, were backwards and weren't very bright. I mean, realistically, they are the same as us right now. The only difference is we've just been born in an era with a lot more information, a lot more technology. But I can tell you, if an ancient Hittite happened to be born in our society, they would be indistinguishable from us.
Even Pythagoras' theorem was invented by the Babylonians.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's very easy of us to think of these warlike barbarians who are really simple and how clever are we? But look, we're clever because of our technology. It's that's it. And okay, so if we go to looking back at the Hittites, I guess as far as military, they loved their battles, they loved their wars, and we mentioned the Battle of Kadesh earlier, which was 1274 BCE or thereabouts, so roughly 100 years before the collapse. And why it's actually rather famous is because it's actually the world's oldest known peace treaty, which I think is just a really cool thing.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
They're writing and signing peace treaties back in 1274 BC.
The Hittites and the Egyptians have sat down at the table.
Yep, 3,300 years ago.
Zelensky
almost 3,300 years ago. You know what? It's peace. If they could do it back then, we can do it now. Exactly. Absolutely.
I think it's a great fact, though. Like it's and the fact that it's well documented as well.
Yeah,
just makes it even more.
Incidentally, I'm looking at how long we've been going for, and I'm looking at how many civilizations we've got to go. I think this is going to be a multi-part on the civilizations.
But that's okay. This is why we do it, because we love history so much, and we just go on and on about it.
and look, it's anyone who's watching and listening to this, if you can't tell that we're passionate about this, if you can't tell that we love it, I mean, come on.
Look behind me.
Yeah, mine's all downstairs, but I can't walk past a bookshop. Well, yeah, but I can't walk past. Mind you, and I've said this before. Okay, look, I've got a degree. It's a bit of paper. Okay, but I can tell you now, the amount that you've read and the conversations you and I have, you're more knowledgeable than probably 90% of people who have a degree. Yeah. So you go and get that bit of paper down. I keep telling you. Anyway,
I would love to do it. Yes. Anyway, we digress.
So if we're looking at, I guess, archaeological and cultural sort of significance. The Hittites actually left behind a lot of or quite extensive cuneiform texts that that went into details about their law, religion, diplomacy. There's been excavations, particularly at Hattusa, which once again there was a German. It was Winkler, who was the German archaeologists, German historians of the 19th century and early 20th century. I take my hat off to them. They kind of went a bit funny in the towards the early to middle part of the 20th century, but the 19th century, their historians were absolutely sensational.
But it was also at a time. Sorry, this is going to go off on a tangent, but it was also at a time where Germany was just becoming an empire, and they were becoming a world power at the time, and I think that's why there was money being poured into all their industries. And it's probably, I mean,
and a lot of it is, and I'll keep this brief because this is a whole other.
Oh yes, it is. That's why. Yes.
So it was the Prussians who actually pushed for a lot of historical research, and I guess the father of modern history, a fellow called von Ranke, he was actually from, I think, Thuringia, which is in or around Saxony, but he went to Prussia, and the whole thought behind it was because they were trying to use history to forge a German national identity. But in doing so, we get some of the greatest early modern history writings that you'll find. I'm a big von Ranke fan. He had some wacky ideas on a few things, but he was a 19th century German. Yeah. There's a whole deep dive we can do into von Ranke.
I think as well, like, so Hugo Winkler revealed the sites, but I don't know enough about the Hittites, and I'd like to learn more because it seems like there is a treasure trove of information about this culture, and it'd be fascinating to dive in like a lot more into because they're not one of the popular ones from the ancient world. Like everyone thinks of ancient Greece or ancient Rome or ancient Egypt, and you get these really interesting cultures that don't have a lot of info on it. Or we do, but it's not. Yeah.
Yep. And look, the Hittites have done us a great service by leaving so much behind for us that we can look into it. And look, there's probably, I keep saying this is the theme of there's a whole episode we could do just on the Hittites alone. Probably a number of episodes on the Hittites alone. But look, I guess their society collapses at the time of the Bronze Age collapse, and look, it collapses because of the reasons of the Bronze Age collapse, which we'll go into after, and sort of post the collapse, they sort of fragmented into smaller, sort of what you call neo-Hittite states, which they had a lot of the same similar culture, similar practices, heritage, but they didn't have political unity. They were very much separated.
They were,
and I guess similar to the Dark Age or the Greek Dark Age. We do lose a lot of information sort of in the surrounding years.
And then they move as well. Move location.
The name. Whether they move or another, I think it's probably more likely it's another society that adopts their name. Which happens. I mean, Romania is another modern example of it. Where they speak a Roman language and but they're not Italian. So they had what is interesting about them is, as we mentioned, iron is certainly something, but also their legal codes and their law system. It was really, really progressive. And in fact, they were one of the very few societies of that era who emphasized compensation over punishment. which is more of a modern concept that really even Western society's only really adapted in the last few hundred years. So, look, I think had it not been for the collapse, I think the Hittites would have been the center. They would have been to the world what the Greeks or the Romans were.
Yeah, they could have been.
They were so far advanced in so many areas, and they were in the perfect location. They were really the center of the world, the Hittites.
Yeah.
And I don't think they get enough credit in
as were the Ottomans a few centuries later. Like that central physical location is just, you've got the
whole reason that Columbus went looking, the whole reason Columbus stumbled into the Americas is because they were looking for an alternative route, so they weren't getting taxed by the Ottomans, because everything coming from India had to go through there. Once again, that's a whole tangent. Let us move on. Let us move on to a lesser known place. It's a little place called Egypt. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Egypt, yes, Egypt. So the Egyptian, what is known as the New Kingdom, which existed from roughly around about sort of the mid 1500s BC till they survived the Bronze Age collapse, but they were never ever the same. So they were one of the greatest powers in the world for quite a long time. One of the most famous, well-known civilizations, but they've never quite recovered after the Bronze Age collapse. So the New Kingdom really lasted probably about 100 years after, and they did defeat the Sea People, but at a great cost.
And there's tablets with writings talking about the Sea Peoples as well a few times.
In fact, that's I believe where we get one of the references. No, sorry, the Sea People reference I think comes from the Minoans, whereas the Egyptians actually name them as individual groups.
Yeah, those. Yes, it is.
Which we don't really know. Like they name all of them. I think the only one that we really can sort of say we know who it is the Peliset, which it seems to be the Philistines.
Yes, but the others are all.
The others, there's a lot of conjecture. It could be from Sicily. I've got a whole theory on it that we'll go into down the track that Dan disagrees with, which will be fun to discuss.
Yes, another episode.
That'll be a couple of episodes. All these episodes. So you've got a lot coming up.
Yes.
So I think it's fair to say that the New Kingdom is absolutely the most prosperous and influential era for Egypt. Even more so, I believe, than the Mamluks that came, sort of thousands of years later. They had sort of fairly expansive territories for the time. Their architecture was magnificent,
and they even had like Greek and Minoan and Mycenaean artists come in, and there's whole murals and stuff that still have been kept in great condition. It's just like, it was very cosmopolitan.
Definitely. So, look, their political structure, I think we know that, I think most people will know the pharaohs or the kings, and certainly there's some really iconic rulers, like Ramesses II, Tutankhamun, great pharaohs of history come from this period. And some of the projects that, like you were saying, that they had, like, Abu Simbel. It's amazing. If you ever get the chance to go and see an Egyptian, anything Egyptian at a museum, it will blow your mind. And funnily enough, when I went and had a look, there was an Egyptian display at the Australian Museum not too long ago, and there was these glorious, just sort of the sarcophaguses. They were so grand, beautiful, and well designed. And then you have a look at them post Bronze Age collapse, and they're They're pretty basic and pretty wooden. So it's a real great example and demonstration of how society actually did like collapse. You know, how
Oh yeah.
so much was lost as a result of the Bronze Age collapse.
And also as well, every pharaoh was considered to be a god.
Yes, definitely.
They considered themselves to be God, and that's why I think they got buried with all their servants alive and all their possessions to take them to the next life.
Absolutely. So look, economically, they were a big player in trade. They were a huge one. Yeah, the Nile Delta, the Nile, the banks of the Nile were some of the best agricultural area that certainly was around at the time. And the annual flooding of the Nile certainly helped that. So they had a huge trade there, and they also, because they were in Africa, and they had a lot of access to things like ivory, gold. They traded things like papyrus, linen, grain, through these networks, through both the Mediterranean region and down into Africa. I think they were in a similar position to the Hittites, in that they were one of those central regions that a lot of trade needed to go through, particularly with the Nile River. Africa wasn't as developed at the time as...
but there was still evidence of the dealings with whatever the Ethiopians were at the time. So they were...
absolutely. So there was definitely the civilizations that were there and prevalent at the time, just not as many, I guess, as you would get in modern society. So militarily, the Battle of Kadesh, obviously we spoke about, the Battle of Megiddo, Armageddon. Absolutely, I'm glad you picked up on that reference. And of course, they fought off the Sea People. That was during the reign of Ramesses III, and that was crucial for their survival, albeit temporary survival. I think when we look at the archaeology, I mean, where do we start with Egyptian archaeology?
Yeah,
where do we start?
There's only a small percentage that's been unearthed or
there's
documented,
so much buried under the sand.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Up until 150 or so years ago, the Sphinx was buried.
Yeah.
Imagine what else, and really, it's probably the only reason they went digging around there is because the pyramids.
Yep.
So you can only imagine what is buried and what's out there. But I mean, what we do have is quite significant. There's monumental temples, statues at places like sort of Karnak and Luxor. The tombs, the Valley of Kings. It gives us great insights into the life, the religious practices, governance, obviously hieroglyphics, because we can read hieroglyphics or translate most of the hieroglyphics. We've got these great insights into the life, society, culture.
And even the interesting parts of the kings or princes who weren't buried at the Valley of the Kings as well, which is controversial.
Absolutely. Everything's controversial in history. Everything's. So look, afterwards, after the collapse, like I said, they kind of continued on in a sense for about 100 years, but obviously not at the same level. And that's because of, obviously, they've suffered themselves, but the societies around them that they did business with, they relied on for trade and for a number of different things, also collapsed. So they've completely gone. So they found themselves somewhat alone, I guess, as a major power for quite a period of time. But they've never recovered. They've never ever hit the same heights. Even though all these other civilizations collapsed, they weren't able to take advantage of that. They They
Even
had to
during
rebuild
the Roman rule, they were quite weak and had to rely on alliances, and like they were not the power that they
absolutely.
were when the Romans came to power.
No, and even when you look at like the Cleopatras, I mean, she was Greek. That was a
Yeah,
result of the conquest of Alexander the Great
yeah,
hundreds of years before.
yeah.
So they never quite recovered. And what essentially happens after this is it goes into what's called the third intermediate period, which was generally characterized by a lot of political instability and foreign domination. So Egypt's always been there, but it's never been the same. And I guess I keep harping on about that because it's the evidence that we can clearly see of the impact of the Bronze Age collapse, I think. So we'll move on to the next one. Now, I'm thinking time wise. I've got quite a few down. I've actually got 11 that I wanted to go through, and we've gotten through 3 in 45 minutes in what's generally an hour-long show. So we'll definitely do one, probably 2 more. We'll see how we go. These are all the major ones. I think I've got a few minor ones in there that we'll talk about probably in the next episode that I don't think we'll have to spend as much time on. But let's move to Assyria, or I guess what we would call the Assyrian Middle Kingdom or the Middle Assyrian Empire. Now, do you want to? I'll let you take that one away, Dan.
Yep. All right. So the Assyrian Empire, so they were roughly 1392 to 1056 BCE. So
incidentally, I'm just going to do a real quick shout out to my favorite Assyriologist, Dr. Josh Bowen, and his channel Digital Hammurabi. Go and check that one out.
Excellent. I follow that on X as well.
He's a good guy, Dr. Josh. Good guy. I'll have to get him on for an Assyrian chat at some point. But anyway, see, you almost got a sentence out before I interrupted you. That's
no. I follow him and I've watched his videos as well. They're well worth a watch. So the Assyrian Middle Kingdom probably came from. They're based in Mesopotamia, so obviously you had the Tigris and the Euphrates River, the 2 big major river systems, and that's why they became such a global empire. So you would have had the Babylonians, you had the Akkadians, which is the trading language at the time, and the Sumerians had probably kind of merged or died out by then as well. But
and I guess for modern context too, just so people know, Mesopotamia, we're talking sort of modern Iraq.
Yep.
Or the northern part of Iraq, I believe.
So Iraq, Iran, but mostly Iraq. Mostly Iraq. And so because they had these 2 big river systems, they were a heavy hitter as well. And then they merged into the Assyrian Empire. So they were very militaristic. They were very disciplined. They had amazing administrative systems and law systems. So the Babylonians and Akkadians created what's called cuneiform, which is the earliest form of writing, and it's the it looks like bird feet stepping on a tablet is the best way to describe it. I don't know if we have a photo, Chris, of cuneiform.
I'll bring it up while you're talking.
Cool. And so, through all this, they had major administrative systems. They had a great military and had a lot of city-states as well. So you would have had Ur and Babylon and a few of those other ones. And then eventually they became the Neo-Assyrian Empire, much like the Hittites became the Neo-Hittites and were never the same. So again, it's another nation that was governed by powerful kings, and they had the central authority, and they didn't really have a lot of internal strife. They did in the early days. Oh, here we go. We've got cuneiform. There it is.
It's cuneiform.
There's a guy called Dr. Irving Finkel who, if you ever watch him on YouTube, he is an Assyriologist and loves cuneiform, actually translates it through the British Museum. So if you ever watch his stuff, it's just wow. He's even translated one of the first board games from that empire that they used to play. Yeah, and
I didn't know that.
And he has the rules as well, so you can actually play it and play that ancient game from 3,000 years ago.
That, you know what, that we're going to do that. We're going to have an episode where we play the ancient Assyrian board game.
Yes, 100%.
Yes. That sounds like fun. They were. I think it's important to know they were more of a centralized power. So they had the more powerful kings.
Yes.
Sort of rulers like Ashur Ubalit and
good pronunciation.
Tukulti Ninurta, who actually he conquered Babylon. Funnily enough.
Yeah. Well, it's I suppose that they became centralized because it was always you'd have the Babylonians fighting the Akkadians and the Sumerians, and they were all fighting against each other. So they eventually became part of the big empire.
Yeah, they were definitely an absolute monarchy. I mean, look, most were absolute monarchies, but I think this is a great example of a real proper.
Oh, they were. Absolute. I don't think there was much civil unrest at all.
The king was the supreme religious and political authority, but they had a pretty good administrative bureaucracy behind them as well.
Oh,
so they had a very functional government.
And actually, I don't know if it's this period of Assyrian history, but it was earlier on, but just a fun fact, Hammurabi, there is actually evidence of a complaint that he rejected some Minoan shoes or Mycenaean shoes.
Oh, that's a great story. That's a great story.
So there is the first actual complaint written down because he did not like the shoes he received.
Well, I don't think it was that he didn't like the shoes, but what happened was the shoes were a gift from the Minoan king, and he sent them back.
Yes,
and the Assyrians wrote about it. So which I think's funny. So we don't know why.
No, but first example of a return policy.
Return to sender. It's you didn't even bother to re-gift them. Because I mean, a nice pair of shoes back in those days, like that was a pretty luxury gift.
Oh yeah, considering most people were barefoot or dodgy sandals,
and to return or to send back a gift in that time, particularly one from a king, that was a huge insult. So look, you would assume there would be more to it. Maybe it was,
but we don't know.
They don't fit my feet. Who knows?
But the reason is lost.
It is interesting.
But yes, anyway, the Assyrian economy was very similar to Egypt. So Egypt had the Nile, and Assyria, as I said, had the Tigris and Euphrates. So they had huge agriculture. I don't think those rivers flooded like the Nile did. The Nile was very unique.
The Nile is unique in that, but I mean, obviously, you've got the two major rivers, so you do have a lot of very fertile land.
Yes,
particularly in that time. It's hard to think of it as fertile land nowadays.
No, but back then it was.
Yeah, definitely. And look, in a few thousand years, we'll be again.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So they had key trade routes as well. So as Chris was saying, obviously with there was Afghanistan and some parts of India maybe at that point, but basically there was the main route through from Afghanistan through to the major centers.
Yeah, and also areas like Anatolia, Babylon, the Mediterranean, they were a central trade for that, and a lot of what they were traded, metals, obviously, because metals. They got a lot of that tin, that beautiful tin going through. Textiles, so fabrics, timber was a big one. And
is that where we get the Silk Roads, Chris? Is that where we get the name the Silk Roads for the trade route?
That comes a bit later. So the Silk Road is essentially the road to China. So the silk came from China through essentially a lot of Afghanistan, Iran, a lot of that region. So
Anyway, that's
into
another episode again.
That's a whole deep dive. That one. That's a whole deep dive.
There's a whole heap of history out there.
Yes. So militarily, look, they were fairly well. Look, most in the region were pretty on par with each other and developed. If they weren't, you would assume that one would dominate well and truly over all the others. But they had cavalry tactics in particular was big for them. The use of horses. They had pretty good siege techniques, so that they were sort of known for that, and they had a lot of, I guess, what you'd call sort of modern military ideas, like infantry formations, things along those lines. And you saw success, as I was mentioning, in things like the conquest of Babylon, which is the conquest of Babylon is a pretty big deal in that era. I mean, Babylon is one of the, if not the preeminent city.
It was like a London or New York or something like that. It was the place to be.
And people would conquer Babylon and they would shift their empire to Babylon.
Yes.
It was
a great place, location wise.
Yes, look, the centrality, but it's a cultural hub. It's and I mean, that's why we still know about it today. And Babylon, for those who don't know, is just south of Baghdad. So it's pretty much, Baghdad is built on the outskirts of what was Babylon. So for that modern perspective, and look, from an archaeological point of view, we know a lot about the Assyrian culture, or the Middle Assyrian culture. It is fairly well documented through things like the cuneiform tablets, which have got, we get information about, laws, military campaigns, economic records, complaints, diplomatic correspondence.
They had a very detailed legal system and legal code as well. So they were well advanced in that. And as I said earlier, Pythagoras, they were great on maths. And they were a very intelligent empire.
And culturally impressive too. I mean, there's been excavations done in places like Ashur, Nineveh, Nimrud, that they've shown like really impressive palaces, temples, fortifications. The Assyria is something that we fortunately have a lot of information on. Like, we know a lot about them. Obviously, a lot we don't know, but certainly
like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That's lost to time. We know of it, but we don't know about it.
Yeah, we can guess. We've got some pretty good educated guesses, but certainly something that would have been. I'd love to be able to peer back in time. I think if they ever invent time travel, I mean, time tourism will be a massive thing to those eras.
Oh yeah,
you probably have a spear thrown at you pretty quick, or a sword go through you, because they sort of look at these strange people from a foreign land who have just shown up with their strange handheld camera devices, and
we'd probably wipe them all out because we're immune to half the diseases that they would get.
We'd sneeze and kill them all.
Yeah.
So I guess the post collapse and the aftermath, they were fairly resilient, but they did experience a pretty heavy decline. At the time of the collapse, there was a lot of internal rebellions. There was invasions coming from outside, I guess, that Mediterranean basin. So the Armenians, in particular, Armenian tribes got in and attacked them, and it just sort of led to their collapse. They did recover. They were probably one of the ones that did recover, because they weren't necessarily in the. They probably recovered a bit better than Egypt. In reality, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is a fairly powerful one, and look, I think a lot of that is because they weren't on the Mediterranean itself. They were, sort of more on the other side, so they were sort of more exposed to, so very much exposed to Persia, or what is modern Persia, India, places along those lines. So it definitely did help. And I guess, it's, if you look at their interactions, they certainly like others, they traded. They were big traders. They engaged particularly with the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians,
Yep.
the Canaanites, which the Canaanites, well, I mean, the Canaanites were sort of mainly city states at the time, but we'll get into the Canaanites. I think the Canaanites will definitely be in the next episode. We've gotten through 4 out of 11 in the hour that we'd set aside, which I should have known better.
And we've held ourselves back, I think, as well. We could go longer.
Look, each of these civilizations could be an hour long in themselves. So what we might do is, I think we've just gone over the hour, so we might we'll put a to it right there. And I think this will actually, the civilizations, I think will probably turn into a 3-parter. So
Yep.
we've still got some great civilizations we've got to cover. So the Minoans and the Canaanites will be in the next one, the Babylonians, of course. So we've still got some big ones. And then we're also going to look at some of the smaller ones, like the Elamite civilization, the Mitanni civilization,
The Israelites,
the Hebrews, yep, and
Canaanites.
Cyprus, or the Alashia. So there's a lot that we've got to go through. So look, everyone who's absolutely. So look, if you're watching this live, thank you for watching it live. If you are watching it in the future, thank you for watching it. So wherever you are, please look. If you like what we do, give us a thumbs up. It costs you nothing to subscribe. You hit the button. You're probably looking at it right now. Hit the button, subscribe. It helps us a lot. It helps get it out there. And look, I think history is something that's important that people need to know about. It needs to be shared. It's something that I'm passionate about. Dan's passionate about. And look, if you're at the end of this video, it's obviously something you've got an interest in. So please support, help us do what we do.
And also comment your favorite civilization from this era. Tell us what your favorite one is. We'd love to know as well.
Tell us interesting facts, things that you might sort of find, interesting. If we've made a mistake, let us know. Give it to us.
Yes.
Don't hold back. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Wherever you are watching this, whether it's morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are on this beautiful planet that we're all lucky enough to occupy, have a great morning, afternoon, evening, or good night. Thank you all.
Bye.